All right, hey guys, what's up? This is Luke, and thanks for tuning in for another episode of the Luke Humphrey Running Podcast. So today, just a conversation about increasing volume. Been coming up a lot lately as people have finished up their fall marathons, and they're kind of trying to figure out, what do I do next? How do I take the next step? And what is the best next step, right? And so a lot of times it comes down to volume. And a specific question asked to me a couple weeks ago, and it was about, basically, the person, I think it was doing the Hanson's Marathon beginner plan, and they've basically gone from like 5 hours to like 3:45 or 3:30, something like that. And so significant improvement, but now they want to just take the next step, and, they obviously want to get better. And, logically we think, okay, well, if I've done this on, X amount of miles, then more miles is going to be better. And, I just wanted to push back on that a little bit. And when I did, it kind of came across as I was not in favor of high mileage, which is not the case at all, right? If anybody knows me, they know I like running miles. I don't even train for anything, and I'm running 65, 70 miles a week, right? So it's just, I do it. But so it got me thinking, like, what, you know, I have reasons why, like, I want to move a person up with volume, right? But it has to be in the right situation. And so that's kind of what I wanted to go over. And I've talked about this in the past where, you really want to maximize what you're getting out of a certain level, right? And so with this person, like, they're still seeing a lot of improvement. So I'm looking at that as a coach. I'm like, okay, well, if we're still seeing a lot of improvement, do we necessarily need to just raise the volume up? What other things are we missing out of that, 50 miles a week at peak versus, going up to 60 miles a week? Are we going to continue to see big improvements? Maybe, but if we're going to ultimately get to a point where that's not going to work. And I think sometimes we just rush through a level just to get to the next level, and we leave a lot of performance capacity on the table. And by that, I kind of mean, like, are we doing the strength training? Are we doing mobility? What other things, like me spending, I guess the way I'd look at it is, if I'm a person, I want to go from running 6 miles a day to 8 miles a day, and it's going to take me another, let's just say, even 20 minutes to do that. Is that 20 minutes better spent running, or is it better spent working on flexibility? Is it better doing a core routine? And maybe it's a combination of those things. Maybe some days it is running 20 minutes more. Maybe other days it's, spending time on core and strength and things like that, and getting those things taken care of first, so that when we do increase our volume, the foundation is in place that we're going to be able to handle that volume. All right, hey guys, what's up? This is Luke, and thanks for tuning in for another episode of the Luke Humphrey Running Podcast. So today, just a conversation about increasing volume. Been coming up a lot lately as people have finished up their fall marathons, and they're kind of trying to figure out, what do I do next? How do I take the next step? And what is the best next step, right? And so a lot of times it comes down to volume. And, a specific question asked to me a couple weeks ago, and it was about, basically, the person, I think it was doing the Hanson's Marathon beginner plan. They've basically gone from like 5 hours to like 3:45 or 3:30, something like that. And so significant improvement. Now they want to just take the next step, and, they obviously want to get better. Logically we think, okay, well, if I've done this on, X amount of miles, then more miles is going to be better. And, I just wanted to push back on that a little bit. And when I did, it kind of came across as I was not in favor of high mileage, which is not the case at all, right? If anybody knows me, they know I like running miles. I don't even train for anything, and I'm running 65, 70 miles a week, right? So it's just, I do it. But so it got me thinking, like, what, I have reasons why, like, I want to move a person up with volume, right? But it has to be in the right situation. And so that's kind of what I wanted to go over. And I've talked about this in the past where, you really want to maximize what you're getting out of a certain level, right? And so this with this person, like they're still seeing a lot of improvements. So I'm looking at that as a coach. I'm like, okay, well, if we're still seeing a lot of improvement, do we necessarily need to just raise the volume up? Like, what other things are we missing out of that, 50 miles a week at peak versus, going up to 60 miles a week? Are we going to continue to see big improvements? Maybe, but if we're going to ultimately get to a point where that's not going to work. And I think sometimes we just rush through a level just to get to the next level, and we leave a lot of performance capacity on the table. And by that, I kind of mean like, are we doing the strength training? Are we doing mobility? What other things like me spending, I guess the way I'd look at it is so if I'm a person, I want to go from running 6 miles a day to 8 miles a day, and it's going to take me another, let's just say an even 20 minutes to do that. Is that 20 minutes better spent running, or is it better spent working on flexibility? Is it better doing a core routine? And maybe it's a combination of those things. Maybe some days it is running 20 minutes more. Maybe other days it's, spending time on core and strength and things like that, and getting those things taken care of first, so that when we do increase our volume, the foundation is in place that we're going to be able to handle that volume. Because the common thread I got when we were having this discussion with our athletes and stuff is, especially the higher the volume got, was that they would get to a point and they would just increase their volume, increase their volume, increase their volume, and they would get to a point where their body just kept breaking down. And it took them like 2 or 3 cycles to get through that, and then they were able to handle that volume. So if you figure 2 to 3 cycles, you're talking at least a year of dealing with injury, things like that. Whereas if we would have taken the time before to build the strength, build the foundation, make sure our body can structurally handle that volume, then we're going to be so much better off. And ultimately, I feel like that timeline is going to be shorter, right? So it still might take a year and a half to get to where we want to be, but we're going to make steady progression. We're going to save off major injury, hopefully. And we're going to continue to see improvement, because that was the other thing. Like it was kind of just like, smacking their head against the wall. They were just doing the same thing over and over again for a few segments, and they weren't really seeing the improvement. Whereas if we would have taken a step back from that and said, okay, listen, I'm not seeing the improvement on that. What else do I need to do before I go back up to that volume? And a lot of times it's going to be, am I doing, little stuff, strides, and, just taking care of ourselves and things like that. So I think a lot of times those are the first things I would look at, rather than just automatically boosting your volume, right? And so I think that's a hard sell, right? Because that's not the fun stuff, right? A lot of times if people want to run miles, they just like running miles, right? So they want to just keep doing that and doing that. And I get it, but ultimately from a performance standpoint, it makes more sense to make sure that our body's going to be able to tolerate that volume. And I think it too is like, it gets to a point where people are looking in terms of weeks and months, and they really should be looking at months to years. I mean, taking I was kind of going over my own timeline, right? Like, so it took me, when I first started running, I ran a little bit in middle school. I ran track, but I didn't do cross country or anything. So I really ran like 8 weeks out of the year in 7th and 8th grade during track season. And that was it. And then I got to high school. I'd say, I got high school. My high school coach was definitely more lower volume, especially for incoming freshmen. And so I started off pretty low. I would say I probably started out like 20 to 30 miles a week as a freshman, if that, probably closer to 20, and progressed up from there over the course of the next 4 years. I got to like 50. He let me get up to like 60 over my summer going into my senior year. But basically 10 miles a year is what I averaged, right? And so I think, and then I went from there to college. And so another 5 years, and it took me 5 years to go from 60 to, I would say 90. I hit 100 a couple times, but I ran into the same thing. Like those 5 years were riddled with injuries, because as soon as became a freshman in college, I had to jump up, and I was running like 80 miles a week, and my body wasn't ready for that. And structurally, I just kept breaking down, and it took 3 or 4 years to finally get to that point. And ultimately that was a big sticking point with Kevin and Keith. Is like, they saw how much I got injured in college, and they're like, well, I don't really know if, you're going to hold up, because, we're going to run 120, 130, 140 miles a week. I was like, I'll be all right. And they took a chance. I think what happened, and then after that, I actually did really well with high volume. I spent the next 15 years very high volume. I have a decade from 2004 to 2014 where I ran 55,000 miles over a decade. So that's averaging 5,500 miles a year for 10 years straight. That's over 100 miles a week every week for 10 years, right? And that was without significant injury, right? Some things here and there, but that's counting planned time off after marathons and stuff. So it was big volume. And then, but we changed the scope of it, right? It went from like, a lot of speed work on the track, like we did in longer, slower stuff on the roads, longer long runs, longer, easy runs. And I tolerated that very well. I mean, it helped too that I had an ample supply of shoes where I wasn't running 800 miles on a pair of shoes either. But, all those things add up. But ultimately, it took me, I would say from when I started in high school and I really started to kind of take running serious till I became an Olympic trials qualifier, it took over 10 years to get to that point, right? So it's not something that's going to happen overnight. And I would say, and I was young. That was me going from basically 14 to 24 years old, where, a lot of the athletes we're looking at are not 14 to 24 years old. They're, 30s, 35, 40, 45, and they're looking to make these big jumps in training. So then you've got, age against us. We've got, availability against us, things like that. So it's going to be a process to get to that point. And I think that's a big factor that people have to realize. I can't take the short-term view on that. You really have to look at it from a long-term purpose. But the thing is, if you do it right over that course of the time, you're still going to see continual, pretty significant improvement, right? Like this guy just went from 5 hours to 3:30 or whatever it was over the course of like 2 years off the same volume, right? And so I just think you have to be really careful on that stuff, right? And so let me hit on this a little bit. So I think to go into this a little bit, I think you really have to kind of look at two volumes that you're looking at for running. One is your baseline volume. That just means what is the volume that I can do week in and week out without getting injured, just going out and running, no special planning taking place. I can just go do that regularly. And, what you'll see a lot of times is a person will start off with a very low baseline volume and they can hit higher volume for a couple weeks and then they come back down or whatever. Like, so you look at the Hanson's beginning plan is a really good example of this. Is like you start out very low, but then in a very short amount of time, you get up to 50, 55 miles a week, but then you come right back down. And so a lot of times you can get away with that. But if you do that over and over and over again at the same baseline volume, if your baseline volume is like 20 miles a week, to continually go from 20 to 55 back down, like it's not probably the most conducive to long-term development. So what you want to really kind of do is if over the course of the next couple segments, if you can get that baseline volume to where you're running 30, 35, 40 miles a week, no problem. Like that's your gold standard. Like I can just go out and do that, whether it's 5 days a week or 6 days a week, I just go out and I do that. That's what I do. The higher you can get that number, the better off you're going to be, because then at that point, you're really a short amount of time away from doing whatever you want to do. Right. So if I'm rush running, say 30, 35 miles a week, no problem. That's what I do. And I do that week after week after week. I would say I'm no more than like 6, 8 weeks away from running a good race, any distance, 5K to marathon, because my baseline volume is allowing me to then just pivot to whatever direction I want to go. And so the higher you can get that number, the better off you can be. So that's one thing I would look at. And then obviously the second one is your peak volume. And the peak volume is going to be, what's that highest week going to look like, and for me, way back in the day, it was 100, I could get to 150 miles a week. It was tiring. I couldn't do that week in and week out. Not a chance. I think the most I spent was maybe 4 weeks. I think I had a week at 140, a week at 145, a week at 150, and then a week at 145 or 140. So it was about a 4, maybe 5 week stretch. And there's no way I could have gone any further than that, right? There's no way. That would have just, that was like me one step over the edge the whole time. And it was and honestly, might have been on the verge of overkill. I don't know. So you do, but that's what I'm just like, that's what you could do for peak, but you're not staying there for a whole long period of time. Right. And then obviously, but that's also the other thing too. If your baseline volume is higher, then that means your peak volume is going to be able to be higher for that short term. And so then that's where you really want to be looking at. But I think it all really stems from what you can get to that baseline volume from. And so, now as I'm recording this, it's end of November, and we're going into a period of time where you're 14 weeks out from, things like London and Boston and any mid-April to end of April marathon. You're looking at mid-January being about 14 weeks out. And so you really have 6, 8 weeks, 6, 7. Gosh, I hear that 100 times a day. You're 6, 8 weeks away. That means that's something you could really work on right now, is just building that baseline volume, not necessarily worrying about a whole lot of workouts. You could continually build your long run, keep it within that, 25% ish of your week. Add some general fitness works. Like for me, I do a lot of fartleks right now, where it's just, 12 times a minute, 1, 2, 3 times 3, stuff like that, where I'm just general fitness. I'm not worried about pace, but I'm putting turnover in, putting an effort in. I'm keeping myself fairly fit. My baseline fitness is pretty well off. And then I get to January, then I can make that transition into, a lot of people are going to go into marathon training, but you could do a half marathon from that. I mean, you could get ready for spring 5K, 10K racing, a lot of different stuff you could do from that point. But the higher that number is, the better off you're going to be, but within reason, right? So if you are at, you run 20 miles a week, that's your standard right now. Don't get up to 50, but if you got up to 30, 35 and you could sustain that, and it's going to be a lot easier to sustain if you're not doing a lot of workouts, right? If you're doing very sparse workouts, then you're going to be you're going to be able to tolerate that a lot better. So that I would say that. And then if you started to do strength training, things like that, then you're going to be even better off, right? Because now not only you're building that baseline volume, but then you're building that resiliency that you're going to have to be able to better withstand the volume that you want to get to over the course of the next segment, right? And so I think it really all kind of stems from that a little bit. So, I think the last thing I'm going to talk about today, I got a lot of stuff here. When people talk about handling a volume, I kind of take that with a grain of salt. Maybe you were able to do the volume, but were you actually able to handle the volume? And by that, I mean, like, how was your performance? Like, if you were dragging butt and you barely made it to the starting line, and then your performance was not indicative of what your workout showed early on, then I would say you probably didn't handle the volume very well. And so what I'll see a lot of times is people will say that they've handled the volume and then they didn't race very well. So they will take that as, I need more volume. And I think this furthest thing from the truth. I think if anything, the very least you should do is just repeat that exact same cycle, especially if you're new to like Hanson's marathon method and you've never done that kind of volume before. I see so many people who are, it's like a light switch on how successful they were from their first time doing it to their second time doing it, just because it just gives your body one more time to fully absorb the training. Now you're able to tolerate things a lot better. Workouts go better. You're not in cumulative fatigue 8 weeks, 10 weeks out before the race. You're in cumulative fatigue, 4 to 6 weeks out before the race, where you're supposed to be. And then you taper and you handle the race so much better. Whereas if you just keep increasing the volume on that, you're just going to keep probably seeing the same thing happen again and again and again. And then after a few times of doing that, you're frustrated. You don't like me. You don't like you don't like Kevin and Keith. You don't like the program. You swear it off and you curse us and all that stuff. And I don't want that to happen. Do me a favor and just back the volume down a little bit and repeat that cycle. I mean, I see a lot of times like people in our community will say that they've never really moved on beyond the beginner plan from the book because it just fits what they do and they continue to see a little bit of improvement. And then, they just keep plugging away at that, right? And so you really have to be considerate of like what is actually tolerating the volume versus what is like I've survived the volume. And I think that's a way to look at it. So what I think, if you want to know, and going back into that, if you really want to know if you are tolerating that workload, one is obviously how's your body handling it, right? Are you continually beat down, super fatigued, and then you kind of go down a rabbit hole, like, okay, well, am I being hydrated? And is my nutrition good? Am I getting enough sleep? All those things are obviously factors, and I think we all know that. But if all that stuff's pretty good, and you're still just not handling the volume, or super sore, you're getting sick, ultimately you get injured, whatever the case is, but you just know, like, like we can lie to ourselves for a while, but then we ultimately know, right? It's like being injured. Like we know we're injured, but then we're just going to go until we just can't do it anymore, right? And then like, yeah, I'm hurt. But this is kind of the same thing, right? Where I deep down, it's too much, but you're still going to push through, and you can say, well, Luke says it's cumulative fatigue, all this stuff, whatever we tell ourselves, right? But in reality, it's not necessarily that. What can you like, assuming that's all, within normal levels, you're handling things okay, but you're not sure, right? I would say you could look at things like aerobic. Well, aerobic decoupling would be a good one on long runs or long tempo runs that are, if you have a tempo run that's over 60 minutes, that's a really good one to look at, and a really good in the long runs. And so real quick, what that is basically saying the second half of our run, and it has to be over an hour. You can even do that on an easy run just to test it, right? Go run for an hour and see kind of what that average heart rate is the first half versus the second half. And if the pace stayed the same, so go like on a bike path or whatever, something super flat where you're not going to have a big headwind one way and big tailwind coming out the other way, something that's going to give you some pretty good data to look at, and then run it and then look at the data. But you're really looking at, and there's Garmin. I know Garmin has some Garmin IQ apps that you can collect this on. I have them on my watch. I think Koros has this right in their dashboard. So you can look at this stuff. This stuff's easy to find, but I like looking at the aerobic decoupling and just looking at basically is the first half, say my average heart rate for the first half of the run was 150, and then the second half of the run, it averaged 170. It's probably showing me that I'm not handling that volume very well, or that pace very well, or whatever. The training in general, I'm not necessarily handling it very well, because the longer I go, the more drift and heart rate I'm getting. I'm not able to handle that as well. So you can extrapolate that out over the course of a whole marathon, what's going to happen. And if your heart rate's going too high, what's it going to force you to do? Right. It's going to slow you. It's going to force you to slow down. And that goes into this thing called the resiliency that you're hearing a lot about right now, is just that the running economy is going to fade, and you're not ready to run that. Right. And so that's a big one I would do. And then another thing is just more looking at just like, how are workouts actually going for you? If I've done, and this is the nice thing, some people get bored with doing Thursday tempo runs and Tuesday speed or strength, right? But you really have a week by week basis to look at how everything is going and compare it to similar workouts, right? So if you're in like week 8 of the plan and you're like, man, I'm walking on water and I'm just handling this, I'm going to crush this thing. And then you get to week 13 and all of a sudden you're like, man, this is super hard. I don't know if you compare similar workouts over different days, right? And you're going to get an idea. Am I truly handling this, or is it like progressively harder? And if everything's just getting progressively harder, then that's a telltale sign, right? And that's different from cumulative fatigue, in the fact that, yes, when cumulative fatigue, a workout's going to feel a little bit hard and you're going to question yourself. But when it comes down to it, you're hitting the pace and you're like, okay, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, right? And like when you're starting to get closer to that overtraining, it's like, wow, my paces are starting to fall off. This feels way harder to run slower, all of that stuff, right? And so that's really what you have to look at. Look at how you went into your race days too, right? Did you go into a race day super confident? I just had an athlete recently went into a race, thought they were doing well. Then all of a sudden it's like they go in there like, I am scared. Like, I just do not think I can do this at the paces we've done. And they're just overcooked. And it ended up not going, it didn't go bad, but it didn't go the way they wanted. And it was that type of thing. It was like, we probably pushed a little too hard, a little too late in the segment, and it just didn't handle it. But it was a big jump for them. And I probably misjudged it for them. Flip side is now we know, right? And there was some other outside things going on. So it wasn't 100% my fault, but I will take my share of the blame. And we had a long discussion about it, and we're like, yeah, no, it was a good learning experience, but now we can move on to bigger and better things. But ultimately, I think if you're new to that kind of volume too, just give it some time. Give it a couple segments. And I tell you, like, instead of everything feeling progressively worse, and I'm talking from segment to segment to segment, like, the first one might suck, second one might be a little bit better, and then maybe you do a third one at that level, and that's going to go much better. And then you start that process over again. But if you're just continually bouncing from harder to harder to harder, you're just never allowing yourself to fully adapt into that. And I think that's a tough way to go, especially if you're looking at it long term. And sometimes we get behind the 8 ball and we're like, I got to have a Boston qualifier. It's kind of why it's like, I'm running 20 miles a week, but I want to get a Boston qualifier in 6 months. I don't know. We'll try it. We'll see what happens, right? But you have to look at that. You have to play that long game on that stuff. And then that's the beauty of running is you can play the long game on that, and even if you're in your 40s and 50s, you can play the long game on that and you can be significantly better 2 or 3 years from now than you were right now. Okay. So I think that's pretty good for now. I think that's a good place to stop. But I think, and I think that's one of the things with coaching when people do get coaching is, I actually am in a conversation with someone right now that is thinking about coaching, but they don't want to get it until, this summer when they're 18, 20 weeks out from their marathon, and some of it's a financial decision, which is fine. Don't ever ask me to make a financial decision for you because I'm not going to. That's your budget. That's your, if it's up to me, yeah, you'd sign up for 5 years, but I get it. It's not. So don't ask me to make a financial decision for you because I'm not going to. But and they were like, well, I would really like to, but cost or whatever. But the point is that what you do now is going to set you up for later, right? And so when people do sign up for coaching and they want it in a 14-week, just coach me for 14 weeks. You still have to have somewhat realistic expectations on that, right? Because I don't get to control what you're doing before that start of that time. And if that's not putting you in a position where you want to be in your goal, then we have to take a realistic look at that. And that's why we do set up this stuff with, yearly pricing, just so that you can, and we give you a break on that. We basically give you 12 months of coaching for the price of 10. And that's the goal, is that because we want you long-term so that we can maximize development, and so it's hard when, and I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that's kind of the dynamics of it. And I get it. I totally understand the other side of that equation too, not just my side of things. But I think just going into that, you have to have the realistic expectations, right? So like if it's, something where you're going to have to improve by 10, 15% in a couple months, that might not be a super realistic thing. But if we can get you to improve 5 to 10%, that takes you a long ways. And if you continue on with coaching, sure, great, awesome. And if not, hopefully we've laid the foundation so that you know what you're doing and you can kind of, go on your own a little bit and now you have the tools to take it the rest of the way. So just keep that in mind if that's something, because sometimes people expect miracles, and I know, I know, guys, you guys, I can do a lot, but I can't. No, I'm just kidding. But it's hard sometimes, right? Because we have these expectations, and we want them to be met, and you're paying a lot of money to do that. But reality is, like, we have to meet our expectations. Have to meet us where we're at too. So, just keep that, and that's even if you don't get coaching. Like if you just decide now, like, man, I got really motivated, I'm gonna go after a Boston qualifier. Look at where you're at. Like put a realistic window on that. Don't expect everything to happen in a short amount of time. You can make a ton of improvement really quickly, but then it's a matter of sustained growth. And that's where things can get tricky. But in any case, to close, I think, I love volume, but we have to do it the right way. And we have to build volume to match what we're trying to accomplish, right? Because ultimately, I don't want you to run 80 miles a week to try to run a 4-hour marathon. Like, we probably don't need to be that. We're probably, 35, 40% higher in weekly volume than we need to be. And, the flip side of that too is I've seen so many people, come to me and then they're like surprised that I've actually reduced their volume and they get kind of mad, but I'm like, just trust me. And they do. And then they PR by 15 minutes, right? And so sometimes that's why I keeping adding mileage to add mileage can really set us back more because it's capping our ceiling, right? And then we're not able to perform because now, since our body isn't able to tolerate what we're currently doing, we're constantly just over fatigued and we can't perform well. And so I think sometimes if we just back that off to a more reasonable level to what we're trying to accomplish, all of a sudden that's lifted and now you're able to perform to the level that you're training at. And that makes a huge difference. And then you can take another steps. But in any case, just some thoughts on increasing volume. And if you want to increase volume, just make sure you're taking all those factors into account. And the higher volume you get, the less volume you're going to want to increase, right? So if you can go from 30 to 50 fairly quick, then 50 to 60, 60 to 70, 70 to 80, all that's going to kind of slow down the rate of progression, right? That's going to take a little bit longer to do because just the overall volume is going to be so much higher. In any case, I think that's it for today. Hopefully you guys get something out of this. Appreciate you listening. Be sure to check the description for links to book if you're not familiar with the Hanson's Marathon Method book, all the things we offer as far as coaching and training plans, all that good stuff. And I will talk to you later. All right, have a good one.